Charles Wellington had always been a man who chose his battles carefully. At 63, he had learned that silence often spoke louder than words, and patience could be more powerful than confrontation. But on that gray Tuesday morning in October, something inside him finally snapped. The ornate dining room of Ashford Manor felt smaller than usual as Charles sat across from his wife of 15 years, Catherine. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the mahogany table that had witnessed countless family discussions over the decades. This morning, however, would be different from all the others. Catherine was reading through a stack of correspondence, her silver reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She wore the same expression she always did when handling what she called estate business, a mixture of concentration and subtle satisfaction that Charles had grown to recognize over the years. Her perfectly styled auburn hair caught the light as she moved, and her manicured fingers tapped rhythmically against the table as she made notes in the margins of various documents. Charles watched her for several minutes before speaking. He had been planning this conversation for weeks, rehearsing different approaches in his mind during his morning walks around the estate grounds. The question that had been eating away at him for months now demanded an answer, and he could no longer pretend that everything was fine between them. The silence stretched between them until Catherine finally looked up from her papers. Her green eyes, which had once captivated him during their courtship, now held a coolness that made Charles wonder when exactly that warmth had disappeared. She raised an eyebrow in his direction, a gesture that had become her signature response to almost everything he said or did. "You've been staring at me for 10 minutes, Charles," she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of mild irritation mixed with condescension. "If you have something to say, please say it. I have a full schedule today, and the charity board meeting is at 11. Charles set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. The small clink of porcelain against porcelain seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He had practiced this moment so many times, but now that it was here, the words felt heavier than he had anticipated. "I've been thinking about us, Catherine," he began, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "About our marriage, about what we've become together." Catherine's expression didn't change, but Charles noticed the slight stiffening of her shoulders. She placed her pen down on the table with the same deliberate precision he had used with his coffee cup, and he realized that both of them were moving like chess players, each action calculated and measured. "What about our marriage?" she asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly interested in his answer. "We've been perfectly fine for 15 years. We have our routines, our responsibilities, our place in society. What exactly is troubling you?" This was the moment Charles had been preparing for, the point where he would either find the courage to speak his truth or retreat back into the comfortable silence that had defined their relationship for so long. He looked around the dining room, taking in the expensive artwork on the walls, the crystal chandelier overhead, the fine china they ate from every morning. All of it represented a life he had built, but increasingly, he questioned whether it was a life he had chosen or one that had been chosen for him. "I need to ask you something," Charles said, meeting her gaze directly. "And I need you to be honest with me." Catherine leaned back in her chair, and for the first time that morning, she gave him her full attention. There was something in his voice that was different from their usual morning exchanges, something that made her set aside her papers completely and focus on him. "Was it ever about love between us?" Charles asked, the words coming out more forcefully than he had intended. "When you married me, when you said yes to my proposal, when you moved into this house and took my name, was any of it about actually loving me? Or was it always about what I could provide, what I represented, the position you could gain by being my wife?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down on the battlefield. Charles felt his heart racing as he waited for her response, knowing that whatever she said next would fundamentally change the nature of their relationship. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She picked up her coffee cup and took a slow sip. And Charles wondered if she was buying time to formulate her answer or if she was genuinely surprised by his directness. "What brought this on?" she finally asked, deflecting his question with one of her own. "Has someone been filling your head with romantic nonsense? Are you having some kind of midlife crisis?" Charles felt a familiar frustration rise in his chest. Even now, when he was asking for honesty and vulnerability, Catherine was deflecting, turning the conversation back on him rather than engaging with what he was really asking. "This isn't about anyone else," Charles said firmly. "This is about us, about the fact that I can't remember the last time you looked at me with genuine affection. I can't remember the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about schedules or social obligations or business matters. I can't remember the last time you seemed happy to see me when I walked into a room." Catherine set her cup down and studied his face with the same analytical expression she used when reviewing financial documents. It was as if she was calculating something, weighing options in her mind. "Charles, you're being dramatic," she said, but there was less certainty in her voice than usual. "We're not teenagers anymore. We're adults with responsibilities. Marriage isn't about constant romance and affection. It's about partnership, about building something together." "Building what exactly?" Charles asked. "What have we built together besides a social reputation and a well-organized household? When was the last time we built a memory together? When was the last time we laughed about something? When was the last time you were excited to tell me about your day?" The questions came faster now, each one landing with more force than the last. Charles felt years of suppressed feelings pouring out, all the moments of loneliness he had experienced while sitting in the same room as his wife, all the times he had wondered if she would even notice if he disappeared for a week. Catherine's composure was beginning to crack slightly. She straightened the papers in front of her unnecessarily, a nervous habit Charles had observed whenever she felt cornered in a conversation. "You're asking me to account for every moment of affection in our marriage as if I keep a ledger," she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "That's not how relationships work, Charles. We care for each other in practical ways. We support each other's goals. We present a united front to the world." "But do you love me?" Charles asked, cutting through her explanations. "Right now, sitting here, can you honestly say that you love me? Not that you appreciate what I provide, not that you value our partnership, not that you're comfortable with our arrangement, but do you love me?" The question seemed to echo in the room, and Charles realized he was holding his breath while he waited for her answer. This was the moment of truth, the point where years of unspoken tensions would finally be addressed. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, and Charles thought he saw something flicker in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. For just an instant, her carefully maintained composure seemed to slip, and he caught a glimpse of something more vulnerable underneath. "Charles," she said slowly, "I think you're confusing love with infatuation. We're past the stage of dramatic declarations and grand gestures. What we have is more mature than that." It wasn't a yes, and it wasn't a no, but it was enough of an answer for Charles to understand where he stood. The realization hit him like a weight in his chest, but strangely, it also brought a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. He stood up from the table, leaving his breakfast unfinished. Catherine watched him with growing concern, perhaps finally realizing that this conversation was not going to end, with him simply accepting her non-answer and moving on with his day. "Where are you going?" she asked, and for the first time that morning there was genuine uncertainty in her voice. Charles paused at the doorway and turned back to look at her. She was still sitting at the table, surrounded by her papers and her coffee cup and her carefully organized life, and he felt a mixture of sadness and determination wash over him. "I'm going for a walk," he said simply. "I need to think about what comes next." As he left the dining room, Charles could feel Catherine's eyes on his back, and he wondered if she was beginning to understand that something fundamental had just shifted between them. The conversation he had been avoiding for months was finally underway, and there would be no going back to the comfortable silence that had defined their marriage for so long. The morning air outside felt crisp and clean as Charles stepped onto the gravel path that led around the estate. For the first time in years, he felt like he was taking a step toward something rather than simply maintaining what already existed. The question of love versus power had been asked, and while Catherine hadn't answered it directly, her response had told him everything he needed to know. Now he had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Charles spent the next 3 days avoiding Catherine as much as possible within their own home, which proved to be more challenging than he had anticipated. Ashford Manor was large, but it wasn't infinite, and their social obligations meant they still had to appear together at dinner parties and community events. During these public appearances, they maintained their usual facade of polite partnership, but Charles could feel the tension crackling between them like an electrical storm waiting to break. On Friday evening, as Charles was reading in his study, Catherine knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission. She had changed out of her usual formal attire and wore a simple navy dress that made her look younger and less intimidating than usual. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and Charles realized he couldn't remember the last time he had seen her look so unguarded. "We need to finish our conversation," she said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. There was something different about her demeanor, less controlled, more uncertain than he was accustomed to seeing. Charles closed his book and looked at her carefully. The past few days had given him time to process their breakfast confrontation, and he had come to some difficult realizations about their marriage that he wasn't sure he was ready to share. "I've been thinking about what you asked me," Catherine continued, her voice quieter than usual, "about whether I love you, about whether any of this was ever about affection, or just about what you could provide." Charles waited, sensing that she had more to say, and that interrupting her now might cause her to retreat back into her usual defensive posture. "The truth is complicated," Catherine said, her fingers nervously playing with her wedding ring. "When I married you, I thought I knew what love was supposed to feel like. I thought it was supposed to be practical and stable and based on mutual respect and shared goals." She paused, looking out the window at the darkening sky. Charles found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by this rare moment of vulnerability from his wife. "My parents had what everyone called a good marriage," Catherine continued. "They never fought. They supported each other's ambitions. They presented a united front to the world. I grew up thinking that was what love looked like: partnership without drama, affection without intensity." Charles thought about Catherine's parents, whom he had known for years, but had never seen display any kind of passionate connection. They had always seemed more like business partners than romantic partners, efficient and polite, but lacking any spark of genuine intimacy. "When you proposed," Catherine said, her voice growing even softer, "I said yes because you represented everything I thought I wanted. You were successful, respected, kind to me. You offered stability and security and a place in society that I valued. I convinced myself that the warm feeling I had toward you was love." The admission hung between them, and Charles felt a complex mixture of emotions: disappointment, understanding, and surprisingly, a kind of relief that they were finally having this honest conversation. "But it wasn't love," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Catherine looked at him directly for the first time since entering the room. "I don't think I knew what love actually was then. I thought love was supposed to be comfortable and safe and predictable. I thought passion and intensity were signs of instability. Charles leaned back in his chair, processing her words. And now? What do you think love is now? Catherine was quiet for several minutes, and Charles could see her struggling with something internal. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 3 months ago, something happened that made me realize how wrong I'd been about everything. Charles felt his stomach tighten. The way she said it, the tone in her voice, suggested that whatever had happened was significant enough to change her entire perspective on their marriage. I was at the charity gala in London, Catherine said, her eyes fixed on her hands. You remember, the one you couldn't attend because you had the flu. I was sitting at our table making conversation with the other wives, going through the motions of being the perfect society hostess. Charles remembered that night. He had been relieved to miss the event, actually, as these formal gatherings had become increasingly tedious for him over the years. There was a man there, Catherine continued, and Charles felt his heart rate quicken. David Morrison. He was new to the area, recently divorced, attending alone. He was seated at the table next to ours. Charles knew where this story was heading, but he forced himself to listen without interruption. Whatever Catherine was about to tell him, he sensed that she needed to say it as much as he needed to hear it. We started talking during the cocktail hour, Catherine said. Nothing inappropriate, just conversation. But Charles, it was the kind of conversation I realized I hadn't had in years. He was genuinely interested in what I thought about things, not just what I knew about charity work or social planning. He asked about my opinions on books, on politics, on art. He made me laugh in a way that felt effortless. Catherine paused, and Charles could see tears forming in her eyes. It was the first time he had seen her cry in their entire marriage. As the evening went on, I found myself looking forward to talking to him more than I had looked forward to anything in months. When he asked me to dance, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a teenager, that flutter of excitement, that sense of anticipation. Charles felt a painful twist in his chest, but he also felt strangely grateful for Catherine's honesty. This was the most real conversation they had ever had. Nothing happened, Catherine said quickly, perhaps seeing the expression on his face. We danced once, we talked for maybe 2 hours total throughout the evening, and that was it. But Charles, driving home that night, I realized that what I felt during those 2 hours was more alive than I had felt in our entire marriage. The silence in the room was deafening. Charles looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw someone he was only now beginning to understand. The perfect composure, the careful control, the focus on social obligations and practical matters. All of it had been a way of avoiding the messiness and vulnerability of real emotional connection. "Why are you telling me this?" Charles asked, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it made her seem like a completely different person. "Because I realized that night that I've been cheating both of us for 15 years, she said. Not in the way people usually think of cheating, but by pretending to be satisfied with something that was never really love. By convincing myself that what we had was enough when I didn't even know what enough could feel like." Charles stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens they had designed together years ago. Everything about their life together suddenly seemed like an elaborate performance they had been putting on for the benefit of others and themselves. "Are you in love with him?" Charles asked, still facing the window. "No," Catherine said immediately. "I haven't seen him since that night, and I don't plan to. That's not what this is about, Charles. It's about the realization that we've both been settling for a marriage that gives us security and social standing, but doesn't give us real connection or joy." Charles turned back to face her. "So what do we do with that realization?" Catherine stood up as well, and for the first time in their conversation, she looked him directly in the eyes with complete honesty. "I think," she said slowly. We need to decide whether we want to try to build something real together or whether we want to admit that what we have is a partnership that has run its course. The choice she was offering was both terrifying and liberating. Charles had spent so many years wondering if he was crazy for feeling unsatisfied with their marriage, wondering if he was asking for too much by wanting genuine affection and connection. Now Catherine was acknowledging that those things had been missing all along. And if we try to build something real, Charles said, what would that look like? How do you build love with someone you've been living with for 15 years without ever really knowing them? Catherine smiled for the first time in their conversation, and Charles was startled by how much younger and more beautiful she looked when her expression was genuinely warm. I don't know, she admitted. I suppose we'd have to start over in some ways. Learn how to talk to each other about things that matter. Learn how to be vulnerable with each other. Learn how to be interested in each other as people rather than just as partners in running a household. Charles felt something shift inside him, not exactly hope, but a possibility he hadn't considered. The woman standing in front of him, admitting her own shortcomings and offering to try something different, was someone he might actually be able to fall in love with. It would be risky, he said. Starting over, I mean. We might discover that we really don't have anything in common beyond our current arrangement. We might find out that we genuinely don't like each other when we're not playing our usual roles. Catherine nodded. That's true. But Charles, isn't that better than spending the rest of our lives wondering? Isn't that better than growing old together without ever having been honest about who we really are? Charles walked back to his chair but didn't sit down. The energy in the room had completely changed from when Catherine had first entered. Where there had been tension and defensiveness, now there was something that felt almost like hope. If we're going to do this, Charles said, if we're going to try to figure out whether we can actually love each other, then we have to agree to be completely honest from now on. No more polite facades, no more avoiding difficult conversations, no more pretending to be satisfied when we're not. Catherine extended her hand toward him, not romantically, but as if they were making a business agreement. Charles took it, struck by how different her hand felt when the gesture was genuine rather than performative. Agreed, she said. Complete honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. As they shook hands, Charles realized that this was either the beginning of the end of their marriage or the beginning of something entirely new. Either way, he felt more hopeful than he had in years. 6 months after their pact to pursue complete honesty, Charles and Catherine had dismantled and rebuilt their entire relationship. The process had been more difficult and more rewarding than either of them had anticipated. They had discovered that beneath their polite marriage lay two people who had been strangers to each other for 15 years. The transformation began with small changes that felt revolutionary in the context of their previous dynamic. Instead of discussing schedules and social obligations over breakfast, they started asking each other questions they had never thought to ask before. Catherine discovered that Charles had always harbored a secret passion for astronomy and had been quietly studying the night sky from their upstairs balcony for years. Charles learned that Catherine had been writing poetry since college, but had never shared it with anyone because she was afraid it wasn't sophisticated enough for their social circle. These revelations led to others. Catherine admitted that she had always resented the formal dinner parties they hosted because she felt like she was performing a role rather than being herself. Charles confessed that he had been considering leaving his law practice for years to pursue teaching, but had been afraid Catherine would see it as a step down in social status. The most difficult conversation came in February, when Charles finally asked Catherine about her parents' influence on her ideas about love and marriage. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had been raised to view emotional expression as weakness and practical partnership as the highest form of adult relationship. My mother once told me that women who married for love were women who couldn't afford to marry for security, Catherine said one evening as they sat in front of the fireplace in his study. She said that passion was temporary, but good breeding and financial stability lasted forever. Charles had been horrified by the coldness of that worldview, but it had helped him understand why Catherine had approached their marriage like a business arrangement. She had been following a blueprint for success that had nothing to do with emotional fulfillment. "What about your father?" Charles had asked. "Did he love your mother?" Catherine had considered this question for a long time before answering. "I think he did, actually. But I think he learned early on that she wasn't interested in that kind of connection. So he found other outlets: his work, his books, his garden. They lived parallel lives in the same house." The conversation had made Charles realize how much courage it was taking for Catherine to try something different, to risk the security of their arrangement for the possibility of something more meaningful. By spring, they had established new patterns that felt both foreign and natural. They took evening walks together, not to exercise or check on the garden, but to talk about their thoughts and observations from the day. Catherine began sharing her poetry with Charles, reading him her work in the soft light of their bedroom while he listened with genuine appreciation. Charles started teaching Catherine about the constellations he had been studying alone, and they spent nights on their balcony looking at the stars and talking about their place in the universe. The physical aspect of their relationship evolved more slowly. For years they had shared a bed, but lived essentially celibate lives, coming together occasionally out of obligation rather than desire. The new intimacy between them began with simple touches. Catherine taking Charles's arm during their walks, not for appearance's sake, but because she wanted the connection. Charles brushing Catherine's hair away from her face while she read to him. One evening in late April, as they sat together reading in comfortable silence, Catherine looked up from her book and said, "I think I might be falling in love with you." The statement was so unexpected that Charles dropped his own book. He looked at his wife, this woman he was finally getting to know after living with her for 15 years, and realized that he had been falling in love with her too. "Is that terrifying or wonderful?" he asked. Catherine considered the question seriously. "Both," she said, "but mostly wonderful." The physical intimacy that followed felt like something entirely new for both of them. Instead of the mechanical encounters they had shared in the past, they discovered a connection based on genuine affection and desire to please each other. Catherine later told Charles that she finally understood what people meant when they talked about making love rather than simply having sex. By summer, their friends and family had begun to notice the change in their dynamic. Where they had previously appeared together as polite partners, they now seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. They laughed together at dinner parties, touched each other casually and naturally, and engaged in conversations that seemed to energize rather than exhaust them. Charles's sister, Emma, was the first to comment directly on the transformation. During a family barbecue in July, she pulled Charles aside and said, "I don't know what's happened between you and Catherine, but you both seem like completely different people, happier people." Charles had smiled and said simply, "We decided to start over." The most significant test of their new relationship came in August, when David Morrison, the man Catherine had met at the charity gala, moved to their area permanently and began appearing at local social events. Charles knew that Catherine would inevitably encounter him again, and he had to confront his own feelings about the role this stranger had played in awakening his wife to what was missing in their marriage. When Catherine told him that David would be attending the same benefit dinner they were planning to attend, Charles felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. But instead of avoiding the situation or pretending it wasn't significant, they talked about it openly. "Are you worried about seeing him again?" Charles asked. Catherine considered the question honestly. "I'm curious about what it will feel like," she said. That night with him was a catalyst for me to understand what I had been missing. But Charles, what I was missing wasn't him specifically. It was the feeling of connection, of being seen and appreciated for who I actually am. And I have that with you now. At the dinner, Charles watched Catherine interact with David Morrison and felt a complex mixture of emotions. He could see why she had been attracted to him. David was charming, intelligent, and genuinely interested in the people around him. But Charles also saw that Catherine's interaction with him was friendly, but not charged with the kind of energy she brought to her conversations with Charles now. Later that evening, as they drove home together, Catherine reached over and took Charles's hand. "You were very gracious tonight," she said. "It couldn't have been easy for you to watch me talk to him." Charles squeezed her hand. "Actually, it was easier than I expected. I could see that whatever you felt that night was about recognizing what you wanted in your life, not about wanting him specifically. And I could see that you have what you wanted now." It was true. Charles had watched his wife throughout the evening and had seen someone who was comfortable in her own skin, who engaged with others authentically, who seemed genuinely happy to be where she was. The difference between this Catherine and the woman he had confronted at breakfast 18 months ago was remarkable. As they pulled into their driveway, Catherine turned to him with a smile that was both mischievous and sincere. "Charles," she said, "I have something to tell you." Charles felt a moment of panic, wondering if the evening with David had stirred up old feelings or regrets. "I love you," Catherine said simply. "Not because of what you provide or what you represent or how you fit into my plans. I love you because you're funny and thoughtful and patient and because you look at the stars like you're seeing magic. I love you because you listen to my terrible poetry and because you make me feel safe enough to be honest about who I really am." Charles felt tears in his eyes as he listened to his wife speak. This was the declaration of love he had been waiting for their entire marriage, but hearing it now felt even more meaningful because it was based on actual knowledge of who he was rather than on the idea of who he might be. "I love you too," he said. "I love the woman you actually are, not the woman you thought you were supposed to be. I love that you're brave enough to start over with me." As they walked into their house together that night, Charles reflected on how strange life could be. The confrontation he had dreaded for months had led to the most honest and rewarding period of his entire marriage. The question of whether their relationship had been based on love or power had been answered definitively. It had been based on power and social positioning, but it didn't have to remain that way. The answer to whether they could love each other was still being written, but Charles felt confident that they were on the right path. They had learned that love wasn't something you either had or didn't have, but something you could choose to build if you were willing to do the work of really knowing another person. Standing in their bedroom that night, helping Catherine out of her jewelry as he had done thousands of times before, Charles realized that even the most familiar gestures could feel completely new when they were performed with genuine affection rather than mere habit. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked, catching his expression in the mirror. Charles smiled and kissed the back of her neck softly. "I'm thinking that I'm finally married to someone I actually know," he said. "And I'm thinking that I like her very much." Catherine turned in his arms and looked at him with the kind of warmth he had spent 15 years hoping to see in her eyes. "I like you very much too," she said. "I like us." As they settled into bed together that night, Charles felt a sense of contentment he had never experienced before. They had answered the question of whether their marriage could be about love rather than power, and the answer was a resounding yes, but it had required them to be brave enough to tear down everything they had built together and start over with complete honesty as their foundation. The stars were visible through their bedroom window, and Charles pointed out the constellation he had been studying that week. Catherine listened with genuine interest, and they fell asleep, talking about the vastness of the universe and their small but significant place in it together. In the morning, Charles woke up next to someone he loved who loved him back, and for the first time in their marriage he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be.